Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Jacob Mchangama, and his new book is Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. And as you can see, it's quite the tome. There is a long history going all the way back to the ancient Greeks of politicians and powerful people trying to silence the speech of critics and anyone else. So most of our podcast is not about the history of that. We go back to the anti-slavery movement as far back as we go, really. Well, the Founding Fathers, too, and the Alien and Sedition Act. But I don't go back to ancient Greece and Rome and all that. But for that, I highly recommend the book. It's a great read. It's an incredibly important book on the history of free speech. Jacob is the founder and executive director of the Danish think tank Justitia, and the host of the podcast Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. His writing on free speech has appeared in The Economist, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and other outlets. He lives in Copenhagen, Denmark, where we recorded this remotely. We mainly focus on current events, free speech, compelled speech, free expression through music and videos and flag burning, and cake baking, and whatever else you want to do or say, and to what extent the government should interfere with that. We mostly argue that it shouldn't. But of course, there are the gray areas in which, like incitement to violence, could be argued, but it rarely actually happens. And the bar is, at least in the United States, set pretty high to convict somebody for their speech that maybe did or did not lead to violence. We talk about the left and the right's different views on free speech and how both can be censorious depending on the particular topic. And we talk about current events related to social media and to what extent corporations should be held accountable for the kind of speech that appears on their platforms. Lots of current examples on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube of people being silenced. Alex Jones, for example, or Marjorie Taylor Greene, and other examples of this. The nature of academia today versus what it used to be in terms of free speech, and to what extent we should be worried about those issues there. And then we kind of pull back and look at the bigger picture of how long it took to get this right of free speech, and how it's really a foundational right to all other rights that we have. If you can't think and speak your thoughts to others, then how can we get our ideas across and figure out that we might be wrong, since we're all fallible? Speech is the only way to find out. So we defend it pretty vehemently there. I do try to steelman other arguments against free speech and just let Jacob counter those, so we go through those. Anyway, if you enjoy the conversation and you appreciate the podcast, which I hope you do, please go to skeptic.com/donate and give us some support there. That's skeptic.com/donate. And skeptic.com/donate. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for listening. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium, Wondrium, the new name for the great courses, the teaching company, because they've expanded and added a lot of great content. And so if you subscribe to their app, you get a 22-day free trial through this podcast. So you go to wondrium.com/Shermer. That's wondrium.com/SHERMER. You get a free trial for 22 days. And then after that, you can either subscribe or not. I don't know why you wouldn't. So, for example, here's one I'm going to listen to this week: The Big Bang and Beyond, Exploring the Early Universe. So there's 12 lectures. Each of the lectures is about 30 minutes long. I listen to them at 1.2 or 1.3 speed, depending on how fast the lecturer speaks. So you can grind through these in about 20 minutes each, which is nice for a commute, a drive, a bike ride, a hike, a walk, doing chores, whatever. Multitasking is the new thing. Everybody's listening to audio content now on podcasts and audiobooks, and give this a try. Wondrium. They have great courses. So this one is 12 lectures. The Big Bang Changes Everything. The first few minutes of the universe. How do they know? They weren't there. Oh, science. The first galaxies, first stars, and dark matter. How big was the Big Bang? Inflation, the first fraction of a second. What caused inflation? The origin of the constants of the nature. Are there other universes across other dimensions? From the Big Bang to the universe's fate. And finally, Lecture 12, the future of early universe cosmology. Super interesting. Again, here's the deal. If you subscribe to Wondrium.com/Shermer, you get 22-day free trial. Not 21, 22 days. So give it a try. What have you got to lose? It's a great source of knowledge and wisdom. All right. Thanks for listening. And here's the show. Jacob, nice to see you again. How are you?
Yeah, nice to see you, Michael. Thanks for having me on. I'm
new
good.
Book.
How are you doing?
Oh my God. What a tome.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I got it. Yeah. Free speech. I mean, history from Socrates to social media. No kidding. I mean, this thing is like 500 pages. This is the most thorough, scholarly, best book I've read on free speech, and I've read them all. So it's nice to have it all in one package. And I have the additional advantages is I've listened to all of your podcasts, all of them.
Oh wow! Thanks. That's a great honor. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes. This is the Clear and Present Danger podcast. Just a stunning amount of research that went into every one of those episodes. It's so let's start there. How did you start this podcast? Yeah, give us a little bit of a background about you and where you're from and how you got educated and all this and why you're interested in free speech.
Yeah, so I was born in cozy, liberal, secular Denmark, where I'm still living with my family, and for most of my sort of early adult or life, I didn't really think about free speech. It was something that I think most Danes at the time took free speech for granted. It was just like breathing the air. There was no real pressure on free speech, sort of in the in the 90s and early 2000s, and then Denmark became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion. When the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten posted a number of cartoons that were images or cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. One of my good friends, Flemming Rose, was the editor of Jyllandsposten at the time. And then suddenly, Danes had to think about, what does this value mean? How important is it? And what I found interesting was that a lot of liberals in the American sense of the word, who would see themselves as the heir of Enlightenment values, human rights, and so on, suddenly became very defensive about free speech. And suddenly they were saying, oh, well, free speech should not be abused to punch down on vulnerable minorities. And even though, if you go back 300 or 400 years in Danish history, blasphemy was punishable by cutting off the tongue, the head, and the hand of people. So Denmark has a very dark history of religious censorship, and it took a while to get rid of that and get what I would say are better values instead. But apparently those lessons were being sort of unlearned when the narrative was that because Muslims in Denmark were a minority, these cartoons were essentially a form of racism or an attempt to demonize them, when actually anyone who had read the piece that accompanied the cartoons could read for themselves that they were explicitly a defense of Enlightenment values. They said that Muslims should be as equal citizens, must suffer the same type of scorn and mockery that all other adherents of religions, and you have every right to be offended about religious cartoons. It's very human to be offended. You can be offended. I can be offended. We might be offended by different things, but you don't have a right not to be offended, and you certainly don't have a right to sort of short circuit the democratic debate. So that was what really got me thinking about free speech and why I've sort of obsessively looked into this ideal ever since.
So this is your job now, right? Your day job. You are a defender of free speech. Yeah. You have a podcast. You write a lot about this subject.
Yeah, you know, when you call yourself a defender of free speech and you live in a liberal democracy like Denmark, you know, it's not, you know, I'm not risking my life. But yeah, I run a think tank called Justitia, where we also have a project called the Future of Free Speech, where we do a lot of research and advocacy on free speech issues. So that's what I do. Yeah, I spend most of my time thinking, writing, talking, speaking about free speech, including now.
You know, we used to have an organization like that in America. It was called the ACLU, but something happened to them. They've gone full woke and anti-racism, and they've kind of abandoned the fundamental principles of free speech. But we can get to that in a minute. I just want to point out we're recording this on Monday, January 3rd. This is the day after a representative in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was deplatformed from Twitter for posting comments about vaccines and so on. And then somebody posted this graphic this morning. I'll just read it to you because you won't be able to see it. But it's a decision tree. So at the top it says, "Did the U.S. government fine, censor, or imprison you for something you said? If yes, your First Amendment rights have been violated. If no, but Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, etc. banned me and/or people made fun of me, your First Amendment rights were not violated. You were probably being a dick. Suck it up." So maybe we'll start there. What's the difference between a government censoring people and a private company, you know, like a for-profit company like Twitter or Facebook or Alphabet?
Yeah, I think here it's really useful to distinguish between the legal protection of free speech via fundamental constitutional rights like the First Amendment of the US Constitution, and what I like to call the culture of free speech, because those two are interdependent, I would say. So I would agree. I think it's a good idea that the First Amendment only protects you from government action. I would also say that even though I don't agree with many, I don't agree with the community standards of most of the major platforms. And I think, essentially, I think they have an impossible job because they're trying to please so many different people, and sort of it becomes moral panics that guide them rather than any sort of major principles. So I don't think you should have First Amendment protections against being deplatformed from Twitter. But that does not. But then I see a lot of people in this debate saying, "Oh, well, then it's not a free speech issue at all if you're being deplatformed from social media." And that I would disagree about that. For a politician, whether you have any sympathy with the what I would probably characterize as insane conspiracy theories that this particular individual has been spouting, or not. For a politician, being on Twitter is a big deal. Being on Facebook is a big deal. So her practical exercise of free speech is obviously being limited. And I think John Stuart Mill actually, when you read On Liberty, explains this. He says it's not enough. In order to secure free speech, it's not enough to protect against the tyranny of the magistrate. You also need to have protections sort of against the tendency of society to impose its values on individual opinion through other means. And I think that's a very important discussion to have in the realm of social media. The very tricky issue of that is that these platforms are global. They cater to billions of people, depending on which specific platform. And if you look at the attitudes of people around the world, almost everyone around the world will say free speech is important. So I think we did a survey in June. 94%, I think, say that free speech is important. But then, so everyone supports free speech in the abstract. But then when you ask people, should free speech include the right to offend religion, to offend minorities, then you see huge differences between countries and also within countries. And that's why it becomes impossible for these platforms who, ultimately, their most important stakeholders are their shareholders, and they want to be good friends with politicians, with advertisers, and so on. So the early days of sort of civil libertarian ideals that underpinned the early social media platforms has been seriously tempered and is no longer the guiding principles, and that has caused for the practical exercise of free speech online.
Right. I see Joe Rogan hopped over to Gitter, Gettr, which is the kind of conservative response to Twitter. And, he took 8 million people with him, or I didn't take, I guess just added, because people can belong to multiple platforms at the same time. So maybe that would be a market solution, which I had been proposed for quite some time, but I was always told that companies like Twitter and Facebook and Alphabet/YouTube have such a huge market head start that no matter how much money a startup might have, they're never going to catch up because of the Matthew effect. To those who have more shall be given, and the rest just kind of fall away. Or a Pareto distribution where 10% of the companies have 90% of the customers and make 90% of the money. So there's no way anybody can get a toehold. So okay, all right. So then that would suggest we need government to step in to break up the monopoly under antitrust laws. So it's not quite a free speech issue, but it's triggered by free speech. But now I'm looking at this Gitter, and it looks like it's taken off yesterday and today really rapidly. Like millions and millions by the hour are going over there. Maybe that is a solution.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult to say. I'm not an expert on the technical side, and will Facebook, will Twitter, will YouTube have the sort of dominant positions that they enjoy today in 5 or 10 years? I don't think that's given at all. Just look at the rise of TikTok, for instance. Spectacular rise. I don't really get TikTok. My daughter is on there. I try to limit her time on TikTok. It doesn't always appear. I'm not in favor of complete free speech for children. I have to admit. But that would be my hope. But I would say that when I look at the history of free speech generally, sort of as a rule of thumb, a pretty strong rule of thumb, I think a decentralized information environment or ecosystem of opinion and information tends to be a lot healthier for free speech than a centralized one, whether it's sort of, worst case is sort of the centralized government control of like, Stalinist Soviet Union. Sort of that's probably today's China might be the most censored state in the world, but prior to that, it might have been sort of Stalin in the Soviet Union, because Stalin himself, was an avid reader and cultural critic, and then sort of did a lot of the censoring himself. And it would be a pretty good idea if you were a sort of a playwright or a writer or a journalist to sort of conform to Stalin's ideas of what should be printed and what shouldn't be printed. But private centralized control of speech also has its dangers. So obviously, if Facebook and Twitter say certain ideas can no longer be expressed on our platforms, that is likely to have an impact on what is being shared. That's why my hope is that we get a more back to the sort of the earlier days of the internet, when we had sort of a blogosphere. When we had a blogosphere, no one cared about the content moderation rules of even the most popular blogs, because they wouldn't, they wouldn't have enough users. Even if they had a sort of 1 million readers, it wouldn't affect the totality of your online experience. But today, when you have centralized platforms, the content moderation decisions of these behemoths have a real impact on the practical exercise of free speech.
Right. So this would be like in the 90s if 10 people had 4 billion followers on their blogs and no one else could come even remotely close. That would feel different than the way it actually played out.
Yeah. That would have been different, but that was really not how the blogosphere sort of functioned at the time. you and I probably both remember those days, maybe a bit misty-eyed. Of course, the today, it just because, I just think a lot of people don't care enough about, free speech or their privacy to sort of say, well, I want to go back to the days of the decentralized platforms or the blogosphere or something like that, rather than having everything the way that you have, for instance, with Facebook. It's just so much easier, right? But I think there are a lot of interesting firms out there who are working on a more decentralized social media environment. I think Twitter even is working on it. So that to me, I think that is more the solution. I don't, we're never going to have perfect agreement about free speech where the limits should be drawn. But I think that might create a healthier environment for online free speech than the more sort of centralized environment that we're living through right now.
Yeah. When I try to put myself into one of these companies, like let's say you were hired by YouTube or Facebook or Twitter to consult for them, and the corporate lawyers come to you and they say, Jacob, we're worried about getting sued if we allow these, libelous, violence promoting people on here. What if ISIS comes on? And we can't allow ISIS to recruit members. What should we? What if somebody dies from something somebody posts on our platform and they sue us? Or worse, the government's going to break us up into 3 companies, and like they did the phone companies back in the 80s and the airlines and so forth. We don't want this to happen. What should we do?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. And I think, initially, famously Twitter sort of only half jokingly called itself the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party back in 2012, and that has sort of long since been abandoned. There was a Twitter representative when they were called before the British Parliament who said, sort of waved the white flag and said, they no longer could defend sort of John Stuart Mill philosophy. And you're absolutely right. Also, just because, like I said, we fundamentally disagree about where the limits are, and then in addition. The European Union, in Europe, in European democracies, there are not as strong free speech protections as enjoyed in the US under the First Amendment, nor under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which protects social media companies from offers broad protections against user liability of their users. So that means that, so if you're Facebook or Twitter or Google, you might want to appease the European Union and then draft your rules sort of to more or less conform to the European standard, which is, of course, these are liberal democracies, but they all prohibit hate speech in very different ways. Some of them even prohibit fake news. Many have sort of strict defamation laws and so on. And so you have a situation where you could say you have a moderation without representation, in a sense, for a lot of people around the world, because the standards tend to perhaps mirror certain countries over others, because these companies are afraid of incurring legal liability in these countries. And also, if you're a for-profit company, and you might be motivated, free speech might be what motivated you initially, but once you have a lot of shareholders, you have advertisers that you want to satisfy. Are you really going to bat for neo-Nazis to be on your platform that 99.9% of people are happy to see gone? You have a few free speech fundamentalists like myself and you who say, it's important to stand up for the rights of even of these people. Then ultimately it becomes easy. But then you have sort of the unintended consequences of that is that once you say, these people should be thrown off, others will say, well, why not? Our taboos should be respected as well. And you saw that, I think in 2018, Mark Zuckerberg said, he defended Facebook's decision on not removing Holocaust denial. Now, Holocaust denial is prohibited in around 17 European Union states. So it's criminalized, various forms of Holocaust denial, and Mark Zuckerberg defended, said it was important sort of to have that. And then in 2020 he reversed the decision, and Facebook started to removing that. And then the Prime Minister, I believe, of Pakistan, then wrote a nice letter to Mark Zuckerberg saying, you should also remove anti-Muslim hatred, which in Pakistan is defined as any criticism of religion, essentially, especially Islam. And then it becomes very difficult for these companies to have any kind of sort of principled approach to it, and then it becomes sort of a race to the gutter. And also, I think you see a lot of civil society organizations, NGOs, who see it as a way for them to get wins and visibility if they're able to say, we ensured that Twitter will no longer tolerate transphobic content or anti-Islamophobia or whatever topic it could be, and very few pushing in the other direction. Unfortunately, of course, there will always be those who care deeply about one type of content. Let's say, hey, it's important to keep up this type of content, but unless you're willing to defend sort of on a very principled basis, it becomes difficult to withstand the pressure to remove more and more content. And I think when you look at the stats on Facebook's enforcement reports, you can see that the amount of content that is being deleted for constituting hate speech, for instance, has increased dramatically over relatively few years. So I don't think there's any discussion that that's the way it's going.
Yeah, I was going to read this sentence from your book. In the most utopian, you ask at the start of chapter 13, the internet and the future of free speech, what are the limits of online free speech and who decides them? And then you write, in the most utopian and techno-optimistic days of the internet, the answer to these questions were, respectively, none and yourself. So you can choose to be your own self-censor.
Yeah, exactly. That was sort of the very decentralized utopian, techno-utopian, civil libertarian, optimistic ideals of the early internet pioneers. But that very quickly sort of turned out not to be realistic, as the pressure to remove stuff
but as a principle, but as a principle, it sounds pretty sound. And let me make the case using Holocaust denial, since I wrote a whole book about this. I was astonished when I started researching that, how many countries banned Holocaust denial. And it's like, why? I just want to know, what are the arguments against their arguments? And if someone like David Irving says, well, I don't think anyone was actually gassed at Auschwitz, the answer can't just be, well, that's an anti-Semitic remark to make, or you're just a Jew hater. That's not a response. How do we know that Jews were gassed at Auschwitz? What's the answer? And from there they get technical. I actually met and got to know some of these guys, and they're all men, and they were in Costa Mesa, so I went down there and met with them, and they gave me a list. Like, these are the 39 unanswered questions that we gave to Holocaust scholars, and they can't answer. I thought, well, that's probably bullshit. They probably can answer. So I started digging into them, and it was, in some cases it was difficult to get the answers to some of these things. In other cases it wasn't. But in any case, if it was banned, how would I ever get the answer? And to somebody who doesn't know anything about it and thinks, yeah, what's the story with that? Because David Irving said something about there's no holes on the crematoria, on the gas chambers at Auschwitz, Birkenau, where supposedly the SS guards poured the Zyklon B pellets through these holes and that went into these wire mesh columns and then heated up and the gas came out of the clay and killed them. Where are the holes? There should be holes there. If you go there, there's no holes. So I thought, yeah, what's the story with that? So I went there and, well, there's no holes because there's no ceiling left and Nazis dynamited it. So it was a bullshit argument by Irving. But again, you got to go there, or somebody like me writes about it and says, well, I went there and there's no holes because there's no ceiling. Oh, I see. So Irving was bullshitting. He's lying. Yeah, he's lying. But the idea that, I can't read these things. I can't read what Zundel in Canada, that when I first got into it, he had just completed his free speech trials there in which he was banned and ultimately kicked out of the country. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is not right. Now, on the other hand, just to make the counter argument, it's one thing to say, well, I don't think there were any holes at the gas chambers, therefore no Holocaust, whatever. But it's another thing to say Jews are greedy, selfish, evil people that are trying to control the media, and therefore, what Israel does is wrong, and all of a sudden, you're in pretty thick anti-Semitic language that isn't really a kind of fact-checking thing that an open society would embrace. Yeah, let's have a debate about that. So I can see the other argument, like if someone's just posting pure hate, I hate Jews, or Israel is a terrorist organization, a terrorist country, something like that. That does seem different. How do you think about those issues?
Yeah, well, maybe there are Holocaust deniers out there who are not anti-Semitic. It seems to be a pretty strong gateway drug into blatant anti-Semitism. But I think I'm someone who thinks that the government should not punish even vile hate speech. And I talk about it in the book. Sort of the European approach to limiting speech is based on good intentions, and it's based on the supposed lessons of the continent's totalitarian past. But what I label the Weimar fallacy in because my reading of history is that this approach is not warranted. And we can get into a long discussion about how speech was regulated in the Weimar Republic in Germany, where a lot of leading Nazis, including Hitler and Goebbels and Julius Streicher, were actually punished and censored for their speech. But there's been a lot of traumatic historical events throughout history, and one of the interesting things is at the European Union, a lot of member states prohibit Holocaust denial, and the European Union has sort of halfway prohibited Holocaust denial. And then you had a lot of Eastern and Central European countries who said, okay, but then we also want a criminalization of the denial of the crimes of communism. And that, if you accept the one argument, it's very difficult not to accept also, because, Stalin killed more people than Hitler. I mean, he had a longer run. But the crimes of communism were absolutely abhorrent. And a lot of these countries have more recent experience with the crimes of communism than Nazism. And some of these countries actually do prohibit the denial of these crimes. But the European Union then said no. So in that case, you sort of create a special case only for Holocaust denial. The European Court of Human Rights, the top court, has also said that it has said denial of or criminalization of Holocaust denial is not protected by free speech, but the criminalization of the denial of the Armenian genocide by the Ottomans is protected free speech, and that sends a very complicated, difficult message. And ultimately, it plays into the hands of sort of the anti-Semitic tropes about how Jews, control the media and control the narrative. Because why is there only this historical event that you cannot that you cannot deny or criticize? And I basically think that any historical event, you can be a conspiracy theorist, you can deny it. And I think, if open democracies, if our past, history is obviously incredibly important for any nation to have a better understanding of where it came from, why our values are what they are today, where maybe our values are not where they should be still, where we're still lacking. But if our most important mechanism for safeguarding historical truth is to ultimately send people who deny certain historical truth to prison, I think democracy and historical accuracy rests on clay feet. I think that's a very weak echo. And of course, as always, these things can be abused. So if you go to Russia, for instance, you will see a lot of laws that criminalize certain aspect of sort of denying, or for instance, claiming that the Red Army committed atrocious crimes, as they did during World War II. They committed atrocious crimes. But if you say that in Russia, you can go to jail. So you're not allowed to say certain things about the Russian past. You see, in Rwanda with the genocide, they have very strict anti-genocide denial laws there, and they have been abused to send journalists who are critical of the government of Kagame, who runs the country, to prison. So these kind of laws can obviously be abused. So those would be sort of among my criticisms of such laws.
Yeah. So the argument is that once you've set up a precedent for restricting speech in one area, which seems reasonable because it's so horrible, the Holocaust, then why can't it be expanded to include other things? So the analogy I use is, there's a debate in amongst American archaeologists about how many Native Americans were killed by Europeans. Well, what do you mean by killed? I mean, most of them died of disease and so on. Yeah, but they brought the disease. Okay. And, well, how many were here in the first place? Well, that's also a debatable number. It's 100 million, 60 million, 50 million. And then how many died? What percent? Well, maybe it was 90%. Well, what if I come along and I've researched it and I say, well, I think this is greatly exaggerated. I think maybe there were 10 million Native Americans and maybe 50% of them died. So only 5 million rather than 50 million. Am I a denier? Am I a genocide denier? And should I be criminalized? Should that be criminalized? Well, that's not going to happen in America, but it could happen in Canada based on Canadian hate law precedents with Holocaust denial. And that's also a debate amongst Canadians because they're pretty sensitive about their own treatment of the Native Americans in Canada. So First Nations, I think they call them. In any case, that's the problem. And so your podcast is titled "Clear." Go ahead.
No, yeah, and the list of human horrors is of course very. You could also say, in America, why should it be allowed to deny, the history of slavery or the horrific effects of slavery, and ultimately, I don't think that is the way that we even with all the obviously you have great discussions in the U.S. about race, but I think when you look a bit more detached from it, at least from my side of the pond, it's undeniable that a lot of progress has actually been made in race relations. When you look at toward attitudes of towards interracial marriages, the practice of interracial marriage has also gone up, and so on. And so why is it that almost universally Americans say that they accept interracial marriages? Why is it that more Americans are marrying someone from their other race? Why is it that they're more tolerant and acceptant and see humanity rather than necessarily just a race? Well, that's not because the government said you can't spout racism or attempts to sort of censor racism on the part of the government. But to a large degree, I would argue, and this I think is true for almost any minority that has oppressed minority or a vulnerable group that has sort of gained a larger degree of acceptance amongst previously indifferent or intolerant majorities is that they have used actively speech to protest, to appeal to common values. And so you saw that with the civil rights movement in the U.S., where some of the current First Amendment protections, very broad First Amendment protections, owe a lot to landmark cases that were won by the civil rights movement. So like organizations like the NAACP, for instance, winning these cases that provided a platform for the civil rights movement, and then creating sort of a positive feedback loop where once you gained the right to protest publicly, you could also show the oppression going on in with racial segregation in the South that could no longer sort of be hidden from view. You could no longer be sued by Southern states for sort of the smallest factual error in a newspaper article, and then so in that sense, I think Frederick Douglass, who's one of my favorite characters, said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed, and I think he was absolutely right. You could say the same thing with the gay rights movement. Why has a lot of countries come to accept gay marriage, for instance? That has nothing to do with the government censoring people, or but it very effective advocacy, and also just in the culture, seeing people who are openly gay, and it becomes who are brilliant at what they do, who are your colleagues, who are your friends, who and who just lead ordinary lives, who are your neighbors. And when you see that, and when you read great appeals to common humanity, it becomes more difficult to be a bigot and intolerant, and that actually has persuaded many people to give up previously attitudes that were previously much more intolerant towards minorities. I think free speech has a lot to do with furthering those values.
Yeah, most moral progress comes, I think, from the bottom up, through open dialogue, debate, disputation, just conversations, through mass media, novels, TV shows, films, the kind of dialogue that characters say in these fictional accounts. I think it changes people's psychology slowly.
I saw a great example of that. I watched a documentary about Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, about sort of his last days, where he was dying from AIDS, and at that point, sort of in the late 80s, very early 90s, I think it would be difficult to imagine how horrific it must have been to be a male gay who not only saw sort of maybe 80% of your friends die, but also be, the homophobia and in the broad culture was horrific. Sort of people openly going on TV and in the press saying that this was sort of almost justified because of your lifestyle. And then, one of the most moving things I saw was this tribute concert at Wembley for Freddie Mercury, where you had all the top acts go together, and then you had Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, who had said some pretty homophobic stuff, go on stage with Elton John, and they sort of held hands. And to me, that was just the most powerful example of how sort of using speech, artistic free speech, could sway a lot more people than, if the British government goes out and say, we're going to crack down on homophobic hate speech. So I think to me those are much more powerful examples of what you can actually move through speech.
Yeah, I'm finally reminding my students who are now born after 9/11 that it was as recent as 1967 that it was illegal for interracial marriages in the United States until it became the law of the land in the Loving case. And it's like, wow. And, the polls back then showed, most Americans were against it. And then, by the late 90s, early 2000s, the polls, would you move out if a black family moved in, or how would you feel if your son or daughter married somebody from another race? And by the mid 2000s or so, it was, such a small number. I think pollsters quit asking the question. And I think that's the fate of same-sex marriage. I think people will just quit talking about it. Those that announced against it, except for politicians who have to state their positions publicly, I think most people just change their mind quietly. They just quit talking about it. And then, the moral, the circle or sphere continues to expand slowly. But there are cases where I think you do need some top-down laws. Would the slavery have ended without a civil war, without the government saying, you're not going to do this anymore, and we're sending the troops in? Or in the case of ending sati in India, the British colonialists said, you're not going to burn these women on these torches anymore. You're going to stop doing that, or else. And, we're going to send men with gallows and guns to stop this. And that ultimately stopped it. So sometimes you do need maybe a mix of bottom up mostly, but some top down laws.
Yeah, sure. No, and of course, there's a very big, of course, the government protecting sort of the first black students going into integrated schools in the South, where you see these frenzied mobs of white people spitting at them, yelling profanities, and willing to attack these beautiful little kids who are just going to school. Of course, the government has to step in there, but there's a difference between that and then punishing sort of the guy who sits at home and writes racist stuff on the internet. And I would also say, the government should also, that to me is very much one of the lessons of fascist movements, is that once you have these sort of armed, uniformed groups that challenge the authority of the democratic government and its institutions through threats and intimidation, that's very important for the government to step in there. And I think this is where I'm not an American libertarian, where I think the Second Amendment is not always helpful in your country. I've never understood how I wouldn't want, we have extremely strict laws for guns and weapons in Denmark, probably too strict, but I've never understood the sort of the argument that, guns should be treated as a freedom on par with free speech or privacy or due process or the like.
It is here for sure. I mean, it's the first and second. I mean, those are like the two big ones. And of the first, it's really the free speech part, not the freedom to assemble so much that's almost fetishized, and guns are like that. I mean, one of Marjorie Taylor Greene's tweets, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, was something like, to her constituents in Georgia, if Anthony Fauci and his thugs come around to check on your vaccine status, the Second Amendment people will be there, as if, okay, we're supposed to shoot government agents that are checking vaccine status. Whoa, okay. I'm not crazy about vaccine mandates, but, responding with guns. Oh boy.
Yeah, no, and of course, direct incitement to violence. It's one thing writing anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim bigotry in a pamphlet or on a blog, but if you're standing outside a mosque or a synagogue in front of a frenzied mob and saying, "Let's go get the Jews" or "Let's go get the Muslims," then again, this is where the government should step in.
Yeah, so your podcast is titled "Clear and Present Danger," so that comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous passage there about falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and so forth. So we're 3 days away from the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. Rumors have it, Trump's going to give a big speech on the anniversary, and he's going to double down. They stole the election, and these were patriots going in to protect their election, their democracy, their country, their rights, and so on. How do you think about the speech that Trump gave that morning? There but for Trump, would it have happened? It's not clear to me that, there was some organization besides Trump going on, I guess, in the weeks build up to that. Although, of course, he was egging it on with all the rigged election conspiracy theory stuff. But how do you determine, how does the law, or even just kind of how you think about free speech, to when speech can actually incite violence? It's not super clear on Trump, because he did say peacefully, we're going to go peacefully. But his rhetoric was quite militant, like, we're going to go down there and we're going to be strong and we're not going to let them steal our country. And, it's like, okay, if you really believe that somebody's doing something to you, here's my analogy. So let's say you're at work and your neighbor calls and says, hey, there's something funny going on at your house. There's like people lurking around. I just thought I'd let you know. And you call the police, you go, hey, my neighbor says so. And then the police call back, well, we drove by, we didn't see anything. You're like, oh, okay. And then the neighbor calls back, oh my God, they got like a moving truck in your front driveway. I mean, I think they're stealing your stuff. And you call back the police, they go, well, we didn't see anything. And you're like, I'm going home and I'm getting my gun, because if somebody's stealing my stuff and threatening my family, so that's kind of the mindset. If you really believe that, maybe that's not an incitement to violence. Maybe that's patriotism or something. That's the argument Trump will make, I think.
Yeah, well, so I'm not a First Amendment expert, but when I look at the words that Trump specifically made at the Stop the Steal rally, it would not seem to me that they sort of fulfill the criteria of Brandenburg versus Ohio, which sets sort of a very high bar of something like direct incitement to imminent lawless action that is actually likely to produce such action. But what I think was clear in advance, and I think, I read I think it was a Senate report about January 6th, and it's made explicitly clear that one of the reasons, there was a lot, from looking at social media, blogs, and so on, it was clear that there was a lot of violent rhetoric. There was a lot of people who were much more explicit about their violent motivation to potentially commit violence than Trump was. And I think, I can't quote it on top of my mind, but the FBI, and I think Department of Homeland Security, or whatever it's called, says that one of the problems was the difficulty in discerning between constitutionally protected speech and clear, actionable threats. And that's, so you could argue that if America had not had a constitutional commitment to sort of free speech exceptionalism with as high a bar as the Brandenburg case, for instance, the government could have done more to crack down on some of those who would ultimately foment and incite this right. I think, I don't think it would have been a violation of the First Amendment if the government agencies, just by looking at these, very well documented threats, around social media, people sharing blueprints of buildings and saying, bring your guns and prepare for war and stuff, just, staffed up and said, okay, we're going to need more people there that could have actually held back this violent crowd. But from my sort of layman legal interpretation of the words that Trump made was that they would not be punishable. They would be protected under the First Amendment. Of course, morally, when you're still when you're still the president, then of course it's absolutely abhorrent. And I don't know if there's a legal precedent to say if you occupy a position like he did, we can interpret his words differently just because of the position of power that he enjoyed, which would make him very different from if someone else had said what he had said at the Stop the Steal rally. But I don't think, and I think this is also one of the things that defenders of free speech have to acknowledge and come to terms with, is that free speech has costs, and the idea that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me is of course garbage. Words can hurt a lot. Words can incite very real harms. Sometimes words can be more hurtful than a punch in the face. It's just that when I look at the totality of the history of free speech, it seems to me that the benefits of robust free speech protections far outweigh sort of the the costs, even though the costs are real, and even though they have been amplified, and the ugly sides have become much more visible through social media, because just by the nature of everyone being able to voice their opinions and share deranged ideas instantly and across borders.
Yeah, so the area of private speech, if we move away from First Amendment legal things, then there's a lot of gray area there. You're not free to just blurt out anything you want anytime. In fact, life would be pretty catastrophic for you if you did that. That was the basis of that Jim Carrey movie Liar Liar, where he just can't stop himself, and he just blurts out everything he thinks, and this pretty much destroys his career. And don't be a dick. You don't have to tell somebody that the dress looks ugly or their suit is horrific or you can't stand them or their breath or whatever. I mean, there's a certain amount of politeness that goes with a civil society that requires you just keep your mouth shut. So, and then there's lies of omission. You don't have to tell everybody everything that you've done or that or that you're thinking, and maybe that's better. So, and then sort of in between those are like libel laws. If I say something about you that harms you, but it's not just I disagree with your opinions, but that I think you're a pedophile or a whatever, just something, you're an embezzler, you steal money, whatever it is, and you don't. Well, that's protected. You're protected against my deceitful speech that harms you directly. At least I don't know what it's like where you live, but in America there are libel laws. Although you have to prove damage, you have to prove that you actually lost income, and you have to show tax records and things like that, or jobs that you got fired from because somebody said something. So, and with the cancel culture, that gray area is getting larger, right? Because people say something on Twitter, and the next thing you know, they lose their jobs at the university or whatever, and and then losing your livelihood. Is that libel? So, how do you think about private speech, public speech, and then libel laws, and also laws about false advertising by companies promising things that are not true that could harm people?
Yeah, so I tend to be so in Europe, a number of countries have defamation is a criminal offense. I think that's a bad idea, and also because to a larger extent than in America, many European countries protect. Have sort of their libel or defamation laws reflect notions of honor, for instance, to a higher degree, and they sort of they've obviously been sort of reinterpreted over the years, but there's still a remnant of that, and that of course was a means to protect the elites from the ordinary citizens. So I'm not crazy about that, especially when it comes to sort of prominent people like politicians, public officials, business leaders. I think it's very dangerous if you have libel laws that allow the rich and the famous, or the rich and the powerful, to basically shut up ordinary people when they see something that they don't like. When it comes to so-called cancel culture, that's much more difficult to. That again has to do with what I call the culture of free speech. It's very difficult to legislate about it, but I think ultimately, cultural institutions like universities, publishers, have a moral obligation to withstand the increased calls to sort of fire people or cancel them for this or that quote unquote problematic tweet, because that undermines the culture of free speech. And I think it's particularly when you see in these cultural institutions that basically live and breathe only through free speech. If you're a publisher, what would a life as a publisher be without free speech? So why would you undermine the culture that sustains free speech by not by canceling someone because they said something more or less outrageous on Twitter? And especially because that tends to break out these moral panics where it seems clear that whatever institutions, whether it's sort of New York Times letting a science journalist go because he said used the N word on a field trip in South America in a context that was decidedly not racist, it seems very clear that these are not the actual, the management of these institutions don't really think it's problematic as such. They don't agree with it, but they feel that they have to move sort of with the times and sort of conform to what younger generations maybe are pushing them to, rather than stand their ground and say, listen, it's okay that you have different ideas about what is appropriate to say. Our morals evolve, and maybe in 20 years, looking back, some of the things that you've been complaining about, we'll say, well, you were absolutely right. But when you're undermining the very culture of free speech that is essential to the New York Times or a publisher or an art museum, then you're also undermining basically your own status, and you could be the next victim of the outbreak of some moral panic.
Let me see if this is an example of what you're talking about. I teach at a university, a private liberal arts college, Chapman University. It's a pretty bucolic place, very liberal, very tolerant, seems great. And yet, and you don't see any of these kind of campus upheaval and protests and all that, the snowflakes falling apart over pronouns and things like that. But if you watch Fox News, like Tucker Carlson used to have this weekly campus craziness segment, where you just string together half a dozen different film segments of students losing their minds over the dumbest things, and it kind of feels like we've lost our way in academia. But again, if you just go around to college campuses, which I used to do before COVID, it's like you don't see any of this. But the argument counter to that would be, well, you don't need a majority. It doesn't have to happen all the time. If it just happens a little bit, it changes the norms, and then people just keep their mouth shut. So students end up self-censoring because they don't want to get mobbed. So you don't need 50%. You just maybe 2% of the students are snowflakes getting outraged over every little thing, and that makes the rest of everybody else just keep their mouth shut.
Yeah, of course. I mean, let me give you a really bad analogy. So in Saudi Arabia, for instance, and Pakistan, you have the death penalty for blasphemy. Now, that is very rarely enforced, but you would not argue that because not a lot of people are being beheaded for blasphemy in Saudi Arabia, not a lot of people are being killed in Pakistan for blasphemy. That means that the right to criticize religion is being respected and is safe. Because, as you said, if there's an environment where people get met with these kind of reactions, that might breed self-censorship. And I'm proud to have been a visiting fellow at FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and also on their advisory board. I think they do tremendous work on this, and I think they have a very nuanced approach to this, sort of not going with sort of the Tucker Carlson narrative where sort of all American colleges and campuses are infected by run amok social justice warriors, and also standing up for, because it's not only a sort of a progressive liberal phenomenon, it's also the other side, if you like, to talk in tribalist terms. And in many ways, I would argue, currently you see a number of conservative activists and politicians who are pushing these bills against so-called critical race theory in education, sometimes even in higher education, where I would imagine this would be unconstitutional on at least on public education institutions. So, and that is just the mirror side of the distorted mirror image of the attempts to sort of impose one set of progressive liberal orthodoxy by one side, then the anti-critical race theory laws is just the same thing from sort of a conservative point of view. But the difference here is that these are actually laws made by state legislatures, or at least proposed by them, whereas some of these activities you see around universities might be students or teachers. So I think the discussion is not just one about, progressive liberals trying to silence conservatives. I think, unfortunately, it cuts both ways. It's just that the different sides have different topics and taboos that they don't like to see being touched or violated.
Yeah, when the anti-racism movement arose, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try to pay attention to this and see if I could learn something about this, and then the anti-racism movement led here in the States mainly by a guy named Christopher Rufo, who's been doing the heavy lifting and getting all these private documents from universities and corporations about the kinds of training programs they're going to put their employees through for racial sensitivity and this sort of thing. And a lot of them were pretty, they were pretty far out there, as if, we're still living in 1950s America, and we're not. And so I thought, well, this is good. We need to publicize these things so people know what's going on, and so we can push back. And then he kind of moved toward all right, parents, let's stand up to this stuff being taught to your children. It's like, okay. And then he started introducing and getting bills passed, or whatever the steps were that he was involved in that. Here's a list of all the things that should be banned from being taught in American schools. It's like, hang on for a second here. We just made a shift from, having a debate about this subject over here to, you're going to ban ideas from being taught in schools? That sounds like the wrong direction.
It's what I call in the book, I call it Milton's curse, because John Milton is famous, of course, for his Areopagitica, his tract about against censorship, 17th century. It's very eloquent. He makes a lot of good arguments. But ultimately, when you study it more closely, the conclusion is that basically that John Milton is only concerned about protecting sort of the right to free speech or press freedom of sort of mainline Protestant sects. He's decidedly intolerant of Catholics and atheists and people with who are sort of seen as too far straying too far from sort of mainline Protestantism. And in many ways, it's actually a very intolerant tract, however eloquent and however progressive for its time. And we see that throughout free speech history, that people who fight the good fight or fight against censorship on one topic, then suddenly turn around and say, oh, yeah, free speech for me, but not for thee. And so this Milton's curse has sort of been repeated throughout history. And I think in many ways, we're probably conditioned to that kind of intolerance. It becomes very difficult for human beings to hold an abstract principle like free speech, to put it up on such a high pedestal when you feel that your most the values you feel most attached to are being destroyed, attacked by the other side. You can always sort of make these arguments why in this particular case we need to have an exception to free. I'm for free speech, but in this specific case we need to have an exception. Otherwise everything will go to hell because this is so important. And that has just been recurring throughout the history of free speach. And I can see,
point out in the book,
I feel the temptation myself at times because, because free speech feels best when you're advancing it for some underlying purpose that you really care about. If you're fighting for racial justice in the 1950s America, where the police are letting dogs out on peaceful civil rights protesters and putting them in jail for protesting with a sign saying "one man, one vote," then free speech is great. But then when you look at Charlottesville and you see people in KKK hoods and spouting deeply disgusting racism, you really, 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 really have to be committed to the principle. You know, remind me again, why am I protecting this principle? Because if these guys are being put in prison, then someday that might happen to me down the road, you know, and that's why I think free speech is such a difficult principle.
Yes. Yes. Well, that, as you point out in the book, every politician in the history of the world has thought any idea they don't like is a clear and present danger to our nation, our society, our state, and we have to stand up to it. And that particular phrase, it's good to remind people that, you know, when Oliver Wendell Holmes was talking about a group of socialists who were protesting the draft in America for the First World War before America entered the war. And of course, now it's like protesting the draft. Well, that's a very American thing to do. Not at the time, you know, that this was a threat, a clear and present danger to the United States war effort. If this spreads and no one wants to join, you know, no one will allow themselves to be conscripted, which they argued, I thought rather cleverly, is a form of slavery. It's a violation of the 13th and 14th Amendments that, you know, the government cannot just own your body, even for a limited period of time, and say, we're free to do with you whatever we want, including send you over to be killed. That would be a form of against the Constitution. It's at least a debatable point, but it wasn't what year was that, 1914? Yeah.
Yeah. I think these were like Espionage Act prosecution, Sedition and Espionage Act from like in the years 1990 to 1920. I think America entered the war in 1917, I think, and so there was these cases. Of course, Oliver Wendell Holmes sort of gradually changed his mind and wrote a great dissent. Though I don't think his argument for free speech, sort of marketplace of ideas, is a very compelling one. It's certainly not one of the most important ones in my book, but it's very interesting to see. There's a great book written about him. I think it's an author called Thomas Healy who sort of writes how he changes his mind gradually about free speech and that how that really sets America on the path towards a greater First Amendment protections, because you know if many Americans I find sort of have this idea that the first, you know, free speech has always sort of the birthright of America. The First Amendment, since it was adopted, free speech has been sacred and protected throughout American history. But it's really only as the 20th century sort of progressed that there's been any real strong constitutional legal protection under the First Amendment. For much of its history, it was what James Madison called a parchment barrier, which allowed all kinds of censorious actions by the federal government and state government and local officials.
Wasn't the initial Alien and Sedition Acts passed by Adams, the second president of the United States?
Yeah, you know, and that, you know, that again, that's a fantastic example of Milton's curse. You have you know, some of the most brilliant statesmen and in the history of the Western world who have, you know, stood shoulder by shoulder to break free from the colonies. And you know, if there's one thing that the Patriot side had been hammering home again and again, it was free speech. You know, it was the bulwark of liberty, and you know, the British attempts to censor them was the worst kind of slavery and tyranny. You know, and then you know, there's this fear of a war, of a looming war with France, and there's a, you know, high degree of polarization between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. So you basically have sort of your Adams and your Hamilton, Washington on the one side, and your Jefferson and Madison on the other, and the Federalists convinced themselves that, you know, in order to to clamp down on sedition that is tearing the country apart and endangering the national security of the young, vulnerable United States, you have to crack down with the Alien and Sedition Act. Of course, the effect of it, some people journalists, politicians go to jail actually, mainly for opinions that are critical of John Adams, for instance. But the fact is that the number of Republican newspapers actually increase, and I think a lot of historians attribute the loss, Adams' loss in the presidential election, at least partly to the clampdown on free speech. So that shows that even though these people, these statesmen that had been lauding free speech were willing to compromise, there was a culture of free speech among Americans who thought it was unacceptable for the federal government to respond in the way that it did and crack down on political debate and opinion. And that, set, I think, America aside from, for instance, what happened in France during the French Revolution, where there was not a comparable culture of free speech. So when free speech was sort of thrust, when you went from basically absolute monarchy to having to the revolutionary period, you have everything just broke down, and there was no culture of free speech where people were accustomed to debating debating their differences. There had been some philosophical freedom won during the old regime, but basically tribalism just meant that the persecution of political heretics got completely out of hand. And I think it's tempting to see that as due to, at least partly due to, a lack of a culture of free speech in France at the time.
I think my favorite part of your book is the discussion of criticisms of slavery as a form of hate speech. They didn't call it that, but that's what we would call it today. Because race and slavery is such a hot button topic again in the United States, it's good to remember that people sent Northerners going to the South to so-called agitate for the abolition of slavery were considered a threat, and that was hate speech that should be blocked. So kind of review that history for us as a good reminder of what happens when you go down that path.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting period in American history. So take Virginia, for instance. So Virginia adopts the very first state Bill of Rights, where it calls press freedom, I think, the bulwark of liberty, which can only be restricted by despotic governments. Now, then in the 1830s, a lot of abolitionist movements in the North start petitioning people in the South, and also sending sort of abolitionist literature to sort of argue for the abolition of slavery. And how does the South respond? Well, it responds by adopting probably the most draconian laws and anti-free speech laws in American history. So there are states, I believe, like I think Georgia, one of the Carolinas, maybe also Alabama, that adopt the death penalty for spreading abolitionist views. And Virginia, which also opposed the Sedition Act, the home state of Madison and Jefferson. And even it's interesting, Madison and Jefferson obviously were both slave owners but they wrote sort of critical things about slavery, even though they profited from this. But some of the abolitionists argued that some of the writings of Jefferson and Madison would have been prohibited in Virginia and other southern states, because they said critical things about slavery in some of their writings. At universities there were professors who were being cancelled, if you like. They were being fired for writing see slavery things hounded out of the states. And in the most severe consequences, you actually had situations where mobs would even outside the South, where if there would be a pro-abolitionist newspaper and mobs would attack this newspaper and in some cases kill people. So this was and there was an attempt to basically have a federal law that would prohibit the circulation of abolitionist tracts throughout the South, but that didn't pass. And I think, again, one of the reasons for that was a culture of free speech, where a lot of Northerners, I think a lot of Northerners saw abolitionists as these wild-eyed radicals. They wished they would shut up because they endangered the unity of the United States and commercial interests. So they were not in favor of slavery, but they also thought that abolitionists were just going way too far. They wished they would shut up, but they recognized the dangers of passing a law prohibiting it, because then it could be used for different purposes, and sort of the scars from the Sedition Act were still visible, and so this fortunately did not pass. And this is also where Frederick Douglass comes into the picture, because I think in 1860 he's about to give a speech in Boston at an abolitionist meeting, and then you have a number of wealthy white Bostonian merchants who sort of, along with some ruffians, attack this event and stops Frederick Douglass from giving his speech. And then he writes a brilliant short, punchy speech called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston, where he sets out some great arguments for why free speech is essential in the fight against slavery, and why free speech is basically a universal human right, and its status does not depend on the color of one man's skin or the size of your wallet. It's just the simple quality of being human, and there let it rest forever. And he also says that free speech is not only the right of the speaker, but when you limit free speech, you also rob the listener of the ability to listen to arguments. So I think Frederick Douglass's arguments are still extremely relevant to our time today, and he was way ahead of his time on this issue.
Yeah, I remember one of these campus deplatformings or the heckler's veto attempt to silence one of the speakers, and some other students just stood up and said, "Shut up! I want to hear what he has to say." And so they're in a way defending their right to free speech, to hear speech.
I think that's that's an important part of it. And I think that's also basically one of the reasons why you also don't want to criminalize hate speech, is that you actually want to know that which people hold these opinions and the arguments that they make. One thing is just to be able to identify them, and then of course a certain you might not be able to convince all of them to give up their views, but some of them you can engage with, and you can also refine your own arguments. Maybe your counter arguments are not very convincing. Maybe they'll be refined and become better once you actually read what these people have to say. I mean, there are actually probably smart racists out there who can put together arguments that seem superficially compelling, and maybe you want to be able to engage with them rather than just
they do. They do. To counter the argument that there are black-white differences in IQ, that's not disputed, but that the reason for that difference is primarily genetic or inherited differences. The counter to that is not that simple. You actually have to kind of dig around and look in the research and talk to the experts, and there's still debates about this, and I think they have the right argument that it's not primarily genetics, primarily environment. But to get there, you actually have to engage in their work to find the answer to that.
So,
okay, so let's talk about compelled speech. There was a case here, I forget when that was, I think in the 60s, where the Jehovah's Witnesses objected to their children being forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance because they were not into the whole nationalism thing, particularly the, one nation under God and all that stuff, and atheists object to that. How do you think about compelled speech in the context of free speech? And maybe I'll throw in Jordan Peterson's thing about compelled speech about pronouns, using people's pronouns, to bring that up to current events.
I definitely don't think the government should be able to compel you to use specific pronouns. Though, that might, under European hate speech laws that are now being expanded to include categories like gender expression and gender identity, that could potentially be an issue that you could. I don't know that there have been cases, but you could potentially think of a case where that would be where someone persistently refusing to use someone's desired pronoun, and that would be interpreted as hate speech. And I think that is certainly nothing that the government should get mixed into. So yeah, no, I agree with those cases. I don't think the government should be able to compel you to hold particular opinions or say things. There might be very narrow exceptions in a court of law. If you're under oath or something like that. But sort of on more sort of philosophical, religious, political issues, I don't think that the government should be able to compel you to say things that you don't agree with.
Mm-hmm. And I presume you'd say that's probably different from a private speech, compelled speech, say corporations. And here we can shift to free expression. Corporations that say, okay, look, if you want to work for McDonald's, this is the uniform you have to wear. And maybe some other company says, and by the way, we don't like tattoos. We think tattoos are distracting from our customers and our clean reputation, or whatever it is. You kind of hear these sometimes. That's a kind of compelled and restriction of expression. But on the other hand, you don't have to work there. They're not making you work there, and that's their rules.
There might be special cases where you think, okay, this is too much. But I'm trained as a lawyer. If I want to walk into court or into if I insisted when I was working as a corporate lawyer, if I had said to my boss, I want to walk into the office in thongs and a swimsuit, and that's my right. Everyone would agree that my speech rights, my expressive rights would not extend that far. But this is different from in a number of countries in Europe, for instance, including Denmark, where I live. There have been laws that are de facto aimed at prohibiting the niqab or the burqa that some tiny minority of Muslim women wear in public, and I think that's also I really don't like the niqab and the burqa and the signal that they send. When you see what happened in Afghanistan and the caliphate, where but still I think it's the right of these women to wear, as long as it's not as like they're not forced. But then I also think that a private employer should absolutely have the right to say, yes, you can wear your burqa and niqab, but you can't work in a bank if the customers can't see your face. So yeah.
Well, and then one of these another gray areas is that Colorado cake baker who refused to bake the cake for the gay couple. I found that abhorrent. I just think that's a terrible thing. But I wasn't crazy about the government coming, the state government in this case. Well, you can't. You have to bake the cake. I have to. And ultimately, it was treated legally as a case of free expression. That decorating a cake is a form of art. It's an artistic skill that they honed over the years, and this is their practice. And I don't want to bake a cake because that's just not what I do. They should be free to not do that. How do you think about those gray areas?
No, I think, I don't think you should be able to compel someone and what if it had been someone who had, I think some of the people who were abhorred by that and who had wanted maybe the government or the court to say, you have to do, you can't refuse to do that. Would they also have had the same opinion if it had been a baker who refused to do a cake that said, "Make America Great Again," sort of big red cake with white? Should you be compelled to do that as if a baker if you don't like Donald Trump? I don't think you should.
Right. Or a Jewish cake baker that doesn't want to make a neo-Nazi wedding cake or something like that.
Yeah, just to take it to with the most obvious example, definitely. Yeah,
the logical absurdity. Yeah. So I've often on this podcast in discussions about free speech, I talk about this clip from 1986 in which Frank Zappa, the rocker, was defending rock lyrics. This is at a time when mainly conservatives, particularly conservative Christians, were very worried that rock lyrics were, like a satanic message to the youth, corrupting the morals of America and so on. So I'm going to see if I can play this out loud here for you to hear it and see it. You got the idea. They're just words.
When I was a teenager, I listened a lot to NWA and Public Enemy and rap acts like that, and they expanded my American vocabulary with words that were not exactly part of polite conversation, but I enjoyed it, and I think that to the best of my knowledge, it has not turned me into a violent a criminal.
Yeah, the same thing with Madonna's videos. I remember she had, like, a virgin. I think she was had a cross and wearing a white gown and doing obscene things with the cross, or I don't remember what the details were. And conservatives were all up in arms. And now you see the conservatives, like on Fox News, defending free speech. I do wonder if they, to what extent they actually believe that, or have we had a kind of a perverse reversal where it used to be liberals and the ACLU defending free speech against these kind of anti-rock lyrics and anti-rock video censorship, and now it's reversed, or am I just missing something? The conservatives are still censorious, but just in different areas.
I don't watch Tucker Carlson, but has he ever criticized Donald Trump, for instance, for the many instances where he has attacked the media, where he has suggested to opening up libel laws, or the many lawsuit that he has brought against media organizations? That to me, I've even seen polls where a plurality of Republicans supported giving the president powers or the government powers to punish sort of bad media, which seems like an extension of the MAGA gospel. So I don't think it's been a switch as much. I think it depends on which topic. I think there's robust research which shows that progressive liberals and younger Americans are less tolerant of racist speech and speech that is offensive to minorities. So they're more willing to say that should be criminalized or prohibited, whereas they would still defend other types of controversial speech, but they're very, very concerned about that. Whereas conservatives might be, sort of violating the flag, the Stars and Stripes, for instance, or things that are to do with sort of patriotic values and symbols, where they're less tolerant. So I don't think there's been sort of a general reversal. I don't think that conservatives in America generally have become sort of principled free speech. Whereas, of course, there are many shades of it, and I think in general, most people, even though the Scandinavian countries and America, according to our survey, are the most tolerant of speech in the world, but still, most of us have our buts and ifs and exceptions, and when our buttons and our taboos and our holy cows are pushed and prodded, we're likely to fall victim to Milton's curse again and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the good take home from this podcast is Milton's curse. It applies to all of us. Well, flag burning, I think, was also protected by the Supreme Court. I think one of those anti-Vietnam War protests went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, again, as a form of expression. An interesting concept, free speech and expression as a form of speech. Yes, I have to agree with that. All right, let's just kind of shift and just kind of wrap things up, but back to current events. To give you an idea of my reading habits here, I get the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. So I add them all up and divide by 3 to find out what the truth is. So on New Year's Eve day, last Friday, front page advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. These cost tens of thousands of dollars. Dear white parents, we can raise an anti-racist generation with a little website. Watch now at dearwhiteparents.guide. And it's like a 3.5 minute film short of parents talking to their, and these are small children. These are like 5, 6, 7-year-old children about race. And no, this is not a First Amendment issue. Should you or should you not talk to children, or what's the right age to talk to children about these sensitive subjects? For me, I have a 30-year-old daughter. Well, okay, of course, I talk to her about anything. But I also have a 5-year-old son now, and I would not talk to him about race. I mean, this is just age inappropriate. But I do wonder, and I'm conflicted about this, to what extent should we, not in school. Of course, slavery and all the dark side of human nature and history should be taught in public schools at the right age-appropriate classes and so on. But I'm just talking about privately. Would I set here's what I tweeted. Would I set my little boy down and say, look, they used to think redheads were hot-headed and blondes were dumb, and now we know better. Now I've just put this idea in his head, blondes are dumb, and we don't believe that. It's like, but why does he need to know that? Now, of course, that's not on the same level as the issues of race we've had in America. But, how do you think about, private speech like that? What should we talk about or not talk about, or and so on?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer. I try to, my kids are 9 and 12, and I try to have, I think they're sort of reasonably mature. We try to have conversations about that. But what I certainly would not encourage in my children is sort of race essentialism, which I think is sometimes creeping into the discourse in America, even from sort of the anti-racist side, where, I guess if I was in America, I would be considered a person of color. But to be perfectly honest, I don't really think about, the color of my skin that much. I don't think it's a particularly interesting, a thing about me. I am who I am. I have my opinions. I have my morals, my values, and I'd like to be judged on the basis of that, and not sort of any innate qualities that people might think that I have due to my racial mix-up. So that's what I would try not to inculcate in children. But it's not for me to really say how people should. I think there are many good ways probably to raise good, wholesome children, and I like everyone else. I'm trying to do my best, but call me in 10, 20 years, and we'll see how my kids turn out.
See if you did the right thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, race essentialism, you mentioned that. That is what worries me about it. Is that when everything is through the filter of race, given our rich history and complex culture in the Western world, it's not all about race. So there's been lots and lots of different conflicting issues. That's just one of many. But of course, when I try to understand the other point of view, it's like, okay, I see that. If you're black and you are treated a certain way and you have some bad experiences, okay, yeah, that I can see why you'd think, this is a kind of essential issue for you. So maybe it's just one of these conversations we have to have nationally that will go on for a few years, and then we'll go off and talk about something else.
Yeah, or
but back to the point of your book, we have to have that conversation.
Yeah, or in 30 or 50 years, it won't make sense to talk about race in the same way, just because everyone is so mixed, and so these categories of race won't mean a lot if if everyone is mixed around. I think that might be the best case scenario.
Yeah, Tiger Woods called himself Cabbalasian, right? Caucasian, Asian, and black.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so eventually everyone will look like you and Tiger, and then it'll be irrelevant. How do you even know?
Exactly.
So, well, Jacob, your book is great. It's incredible. We didn't even get into the long, deep history. I don't want to give away your whole book. I want people to buy your book and read it or listen to it. But it's, it's incredible how long it's taken when you go back to the ancient Greeks. How long it's taken to get here.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like this is one of these hard rights that if it even exists outside of people saying it exists, that it took us to get that.
Exactly, and I think 2,500 years of history with a lot of setbacks, and I think there's one takeaway that people should take. It might be a cliche, but you really cannot take free speech for granted. There's been so many episodes throughout history where this right has come under attack, where it has been rolled back, and typically what follows is not something that is desirable unless you're part of the very elite that gets to determine the limits of free speech.
Yeah, that's a kind of a good place to wrap it up. Let me just ask you one last thing are you worried about social media abuse in countries like China and, say, Iran and other North Korea and so on, that could spread?
Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that Germany, for instance, has adopted this law called the Network Enforcement Act, and we've seen a number of authoritarian states like Russia, Venezuela, Turkey, Belarus sort of copy-pasting that law, obviously making it much more strict and censorious than the original blueprint. But that is unfortunately what we're seeing, that a lot of these authoritarian states are being smart about online censorship. Not everyone is as censorious and as China, which is sort of the digital juggernaut of online censorship, but a lot of these other countries, Turkey's Erdogan president just went out and said something that could have been said by Joe Biden or Macron or Angela Merkel, saying, the internet was a great thing in the beginning, but now it's become a threat to democracy, and so we're passing this law against fake news. And guess how that will be interpreted in Turkey? So yes, I think it's worrying, and unfortunately, I don't think liberal democracies are standing up for free speech to the extent that they should. I think they're undermining it from within, even with the best of intentions.
Just another current event, just that Dr. Robert Malone, who is one of the inventors of the mRNA vaccine, sorry, mispronounced that, was just booted. He had an appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, and YouTube took it down. Because he's questioning the death count and how many people are dying from the vaccine and so on. It's like, what? I don't know that much about this vaccine. Where can I read about this? Well, you can't read it on YouTube anymore. You can't watch him talk to Joe Rogan for 3 hours about this. Well, okay, then who? I know. I think Anthony Fauci and the CDC, they're trying to do the right thing, but what if they're wrong?
Yeah, no, I've had my 3 shots, and I'll I'll take the fourth in 6 months if that's the if that's the recommendation. But yeah, if in the beginning the Danish health authorities said, oh, this is not, we don't think it's going to spread to Denmark. Then for a long time they said, don't wear masks. Now we have mask mandates, and that's not because they're involved in conspiracy theory or lying. It's just because we have imperfect knowledge, and our knowledge is evolving all the time. And you put different theories and out there, and they get tested, and you make a paper that it might be 80% correct, but then you find out when it's being tested by other scientists in peer review and against new facts and data that actually 20% of it was wrong, and then you go back and you update your recommendations, and in that sort of environment, it becomes incredibly it becomes almost pointless to sort of police health misinformation.
Right. So somebody at Alpha/Google that runs YouTube decided, I don't really need to know what this guy thinks about vaccines. Like, why are you making that decision for me? I can do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, it's also with there was a point in time where Facebook was removing sort of the lab leak theory, the theory that the virus might have escaped from a lab in Wuhan. And, no one knows the origins, but
right.
then suddenly, there were sort of more information coming out that could at least suggest that it was not implausible, and then they had to reverse their content moderation on this, and so one day something is a conspiracy theory, and the next day it could be fact or something in between, and so just with the myriad of information about this, obviously this is something that concerns everyone around the world, and people are going to have strong opinions about it. People will want to share various information, and just imagine having lived through this pandemic without the internet, without social media. Governments worry about the impact of vaccine information, but I think the death toll and just the consequences for ordinary people around the world without social media and the internet would have been much more devastating than what has been the case, even though we may have lost 18 million people or something. Horrible in itself.
Yeah, I had Matt Ridley on the podcast a few weeks ago, his book Viral, where he and his co-author, they kind of stage a debate. I mean, they kind of give the debate of the lab leak versus the zoonotic spread hypotheses. And, by the time I read the book carefully, and it's not clear. It's like 50-50 or maybe 51-49. I mean, it could go either way. We just still don't know. And you can't trust the Chinese for the information they're giving us. So, but even that is, Matt told me that all the Fox hosts want to have them on the show, and CNN and MSNBC, they won't touch it.
No, exactly.
Like, how can this be? I mean, it's not at all clear that this is a crazy idea, lab leak hypothesis. It's not a crazy idea.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But anyway, so, I mean, the only way to find out is, just put it all out there and then let people decide. Anyway, that's the point of your book. All right, Jacob, thank you so much. Thanks. What's next on your research, writing, and activism agenda?
Oh, my hope is to be able to, end of this month, go on a book tour in the U.S., but we'll see if that's...
Oh, nice.
If that's possible.
Yeah, I know.
So
I know.
I'll be working hard on promoting this book for the foreseeable future, and then lots of research on free speech issues, and then maybe 6 months from now I can move, or a year from now I can find another hobby, and maybe maybe free speech will I'll be sick and tired of free speech by then. I don't know.
Well, it'd be nice if it was a boring topic because nothing was happening to challenge it, and we all just took it for granted.
It'd be great if we were back to
I don't think that's ever going to happen.
1999, yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah, right. All right. Thanks for coming on.